Hello, Miami alumni and friends. JJ Slaker here with the Alumni Association, and I am so excited today to be joined by Lindsay Schakenbach Regele, a history professor at Miami, and she is going to share a story that's part of her book, Flowers, Guns, and Money. And so that's our webinar today. So excited to have you, Lindsay. I'll introduce you more in just a second. As far as viewers watching today, live viewers, you're welcome to ask questions. We'd love for this to be conversation. If you have comments or questions, there's a little ask a question button right below your video. We'll keep an eye on those. Come back on for Q&A at the beginning. And also wanted to let our viewers know that in February we'll be doing winter college, so keep an eye out for a week full of noon webinars and some special events at night coming up in February. So let me introduce Lindsay and pass it off. We'll get to today's topic. Lindsay Schakenbach Regele is an associate professor of history at Miami University, where she is also the director of the graduate studies program in history. Lindsay teaches classes on early American history and the history of capitalism. Her research focuses on the early national United States, particularly the confluence of economic interest, diplomacy, domestic politics, and military power. All right, awesome. So Lindsay, thanks again for joining us. We're so glad to have you. I will turn it over to you, and then I'll be back on for questions at the end.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. All right. So as JJ said, I teach early United States history, and my specialty is on the intersection of politics, business interests, and the military. So today I'll be talking about my book, Flowers, Guns, and Money, Joel Roberts Poinsett and the Paradoxes of American Patriotism. And this explores those themes through the life of one man, Joel Roberts Poinsett. So that's the cover and table of contents right there. So if people know the name Joel Roberts Poinsett today, it is likely because of the poinsettia, the flower which became his namesake in the mid-1800s after he returned from Mexico as the United States' first ambassador to the newly independent country in the 1820s. So first, before I get into the man and the book, let me just first tell you about how the poinsettia became the poinsettia, since that's what people know about Joel Roberts Poinsett. And maybe some of you still have your holiday poinsettias hanging around the house. Let me flip my slide. Okay. So the use of this plant, this plant originally was known as the Quetzalcoatl in Nuaha, and is native to Mexico and Central America. And it was used by the Aztecs for dye making and medicinal purposes. And the use of this plant in Christmas decor and celebration stems back to the 17th century, when Franciscan monks in Mexico started using the poinsettia for Christmas ceremonies. At that time, the legend began about a young Mexican girl named Pepita on her way to visit the nativity scene at the chapel in her small town. She didn't have anything to give as a gift, so on her way, she picked flowers and weeds from the side of the road and made a bouquet. And upon arrival at the church, the girl laid the bouquet at the feet of Jesus, and suddenly the weeds burst into brilliant red blooms. And from that day on, the bright red flowers of what we call the poinsettia were known as the Flor de Nochebuena, or flowers of the Holy Night. So it was on a trip to assess the profitability of some mines for United States investors, in fact, that Poinsett, the man who I will tell you about in a little bit, admired these flowers and cut clippings to send to horticulturalists in the United States. Now, exactly where and how he got these clippings is not quite clear, but he remarked on the beauty of the plants he saw. And then several prominent horticulturalists in the United States later reported that Poinsett sent them to them. And then by the mid-1830s, agricultural reports described a plant with brilliant scarlet foliage, which they said is lately referred to as the poinsettia, as having been introduced by him in 1828. So they started out as a novelty in the United States, something botany enthusiasts admired at flower shows. And then in the early 20th century, the Eck family in California pioneered poinsettia cultivation and marketing and developed techniques to produce fuller plants. They promoted them as a symbol of Christmas, and this solidified their popularity in the holiday market. And so poinsettias are now cultivated globally and are one of the most popular holiday plants, with December 12th celebrated as National Poinsettia Day in the United States to honor Joel Poinsett's legacy, because he died that day. So next year, December 12th, make sure you all celebrate National Poinsettia Day. And now, of course, they're a major commercial plant. And some years, the poinsettias are the United States' #1 selling potted plant. However, I did not set out to write about the poinsettia. And I actually think the rest of Poinsett's activities are a lot more interesting and important for understanding the early United States, specifically politics and diplomacy. So who was he and why did I become interested? So Poinsett, just at a glance, is a South Carolina man. He's an investor and enslaver. He's a confidant of Andrew Jackson. He was a secret agent of the U.S. State Department in South America. He fought in Chile's War for Independence. He was an ambitious congressman and a secretary of war who oversaw the horrors of the Trail of Tears and orchestrated America's longest and costliest war against Native Americans. And he also helped found the Smithsonian Institute. In addition, he was a naturalist after whom the poinsettia is now named. So I actually first encountered Poinsett in State Department records while doing research for an entirely different book called Manufacturing Advantage, pictured there, which explores the interconnectedness of state policy, private enterprise, and global markets in fostering the United States' transition to industrialization, showing how arms and textile industries in particular shaped the early American economy and independence during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The focus of the book was New England, where the nation's well-known arms makers and textile manufacturers resided. And yet Poinsett, a Southerner, kept popping up to the point where I could not ignore his importance. His life experiences intersected with the major tragedies and triumphs of the era, including native expulsion and the growth of slavery, diplomatic and military expansion, and imperial acquisition and exploration. The unique span of his career, which crossed multiple branches and localities of the U.S. government over the course of the early national era, reveals how power operated in different geographies and jurisdictions of the law during the United States' foundational years. And I argue Poinsett's experiences navigating this post-colonial transition to nationhood at the state, national, and international levels exemplified the emergence of self-interested patriotism among U.S. officials. So I just mentioned patriotism, and it's in the title. So what do I mean by that? Well, at some point while I was writing the book, one of the editors mentioned that Poinsett seemed to embody a strong nationalism. And in many ways, yes, we could call Poinsett a nationalist for his commitment to national vitality, militarism, whiteness, Anglo-American culture. But this word is steeped in 20th century meaning, and it was not a word that Poinsett or his correspondents ever used. Instead, they use patriotism and patriot often. Early in Poinsett's career, he used these terms most frequently to refer to actually revolutionaries in South America, because he was equating their independence movements with that of the patriots of the American Revolution. Patriotism was a value judgment used to compare individuals' actions to those of the patriot Washington, and the patriotism of the soldiers. So it was in comparison to the American cause during the American Revolution. And at the end of his life, when South Carolinians began seriously debating secession from the Union, Poinsett wrote, and this is as a Southerner, that at least the, quote, fanatics of the North had patriotism because they had an attachment to the Union, he said. Okay. So how did this man, who was all over the place in this early national era, get into these positions of power at the state and national level? So his background. He was born in South Carolina, in Charleston, in 1779, while the United States fought for independence from Great Britain. And he died as the nation, or as his home state, debated secession from the Union on the eve of the Civil War. So his life spans the American Revolution to the eve of the Civil War. He descended from French Huguenots who, on his father's side, immigrated to Charleston in the late 1600s, and on his mother's side lived in England. During the American Revolution, his father was a physician in the American Army, and then switched loyalties, siding with Britain and temporarily moving the family to England after the Americans won. As a teenager, Poinsett returned to England for some of his education, which included a small bit of military training. And this little bit of military exposure became kind of an obsession for him. And he spent most of his life wanting to have military experience, which he didn't have until he was Secretary of War, without having ever served in the U.S. Military. He spent a while traveling around Europe and Asia before traveling back to the United States with the hopes of fighting in the War of 1812. So he returns to the United States on the eve of the War of 1812. And as I mentioned, he desperately wanted to join the Army, but the State Department had other plans for him. They did not need him as a military officer. They needed him as a diplomat, because they were very concerned with what was going on in South America. So what was going on in South America? So when Napoleon had invaded Spain and installed his brother on the Spanish throne in 1808, opposition movements sprang up throughout South America. The United States government basically needed information because they didn't know how to react to these new revolutions that were in some ways modeled after the United States' own revolution. Poinsett was one of the most cosmopolitan men in the United States at this time because of all his travels. And it was well known that he had made a good impression abroad. The Russian royalty, for example, spoke highly of Poinsett. Okay, so he had traveled really all around when he was in his late teens and early 20s. Also, Poinsett was almost fluent in Spanish, in addition to being fluent in French, which was the international language of diplomacy. So that was much more common, but not many Americans knew Spanish. So the U.S. government needed him to go on a fact-finding mission in South America, and he was not known as a military man, and they certainly did not need him as a military officer at this point. So as Poinsett traveled throughout the future nations of Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay, he gathered information to send back to the State Department. The State Department actually gave him a cipher that would allow him to communicate secretly with the U.S. government, as well as with the handful of confidential agents scattered throughout the Americas. While he was in Chile, Poinsett befriended Jose Miguel Carrera, who had recently risen to power through a coup. Carrera was eager for good economic relations with the United States, and so he organized lavish parties for Poinsett. Poinsett was always good at wherever he went, he found a good party. I think he was well liked by a lot of people, even as he also gained some enemies, as we'll see in a bit. Poinsett, unbeknownst to the U.S. State Department, got involved in helping Carrera draft a new constitution for the kind of fledgling want-to-be nation. He was mostly responsible for the first draft of Chile's constitution, which, like the United States is, provided for representative democracy, separation of powers, and religious liberty. It was pretty quickly replaced, but it's worth noting that Poinsett was extremely influential in this kind of early constitution in Chile's move towards independence. And then when royalist troops from the Viceroyalty of Peru invaded Chile in early 1813, so while the United States was involved in the War of 1812 against Great Britain, Poinsett actually got his wish for military service because without U.S. governmental permission, he joined in the fighting, even though, of course, the U.S. law prohibited him from joining Chile's military. Poinsett just simply chose to stop corresponding with the State Department during that time. And of course, because news took so long to travel and the U.S. government is kind of absorbed in other things at this time, he's able to get away with this at the time. So ultimately, Poinsett's friend Carrera was imprisoned, and soon after, the Chilean government, under pressure from the British, informed Poinsett that he was no longer welcome there. Politics were constantly kind of changing who was in power in the region. And suddenly Poinsett was no longer welcome. So Poinsett basically escaped for the United States. Now, because the Spanish government that is still trying to control its colonies in South America, because they did not notice or care about kind of Poinsett's involvement, Monroe seemed to brush aside the fact that Poinsett had taken up arms against a nation with whom the United States was at peace. Instead, Poinsett became considered the expert on South American affairs. Now, unfortunately for revolutionaries in South America, Poinsett advised the U.S. government to not yet support or recognize these nation states, as like the United States had needed France's recognition during their own war for independence. So Poinsett went back to South Carolina. He was elected. To the South Carolina House of Representatives, and he became president of the Board of Public Works for the state, where a notable achievement was what is now the oldest stone bridge in the South, whose construction he oversaw. It's named after him, and it stretches 130 feet over Little Gap Creek. And that's a picture of it. And actually on a trip that I took with my family, pictured there, to Greenville, South Carolina, to see the area where Poinsett spent his summers, we drove into the forest and then walked on this like very narrow path to see this bridge. And it was notable at the time and to this day because of its Gothic arch. And again, now today it's believed to be the oldest stone bridge in the South. And there's like a little marker for it. And it's named after him because he was president of the Board of Public Works at the time, and he oversaw its construction. He was very involved in internal improvements in the state of South Carolina. So he's kind of all over this early national era. So one thing I found while going through Poinsett's papers in South Carolina were letters about what I realized were kind of secret child out of wedlock. So Poinsett's earlier biographers, so there's a few biographies written of Poinsett from right around like the 1930s. His earlier biographers do not mention any children at all, other than the stepchildren that he had when he married much later in life in his 50s, which I'll get to in a bit. So I was kind of surprised to see these secret letters that Poinsett wrote to his friend Isaac Johnson, a fellow Freemason. So Poinsett was a Freemason, and he had many kind of brotherly connections because of this. And he wrote these letters to his friend Isaac Johnson before he left the United States for another trip to Europe. He was traveling often, sometimes for health reasons. Poinsett always had iffy health. so I read in these letters, quote, "In the event of an accident befalling me, I have provided for my son who was under your charge," end quote. So I was a bit taken aback to find out that Poinsett had an infant son who needed a caretaker. Poinsett requested that Johnson, quote, "by your obligations as a brother and companion, never to reveal the name of the mother," end quote. So the woman Poinsett had recently gotten pregnant had passed away. And as Poinsett wrote, quote, "The reputation of a woman, even after her death, ought to be sacred," end quote. And this was interesting to me for a lot of reasons. First, because I had not known that Poinsett had a children at all. And this is one of the very few glimpses we get of Poinsett's private life. There's a lot of papers related to him, but most of them are focused on kind of business, politics, etc. And he didn't marry until he was 54. He and his correspondents wrote little about women other than to comment briefly, on their appearance, or occasionally to remark on one who seemed particularly intelligent or shocked, or merely just to note that there were women, in a certain location. Poinsett most likely took advantage of women when he could. Upon his appointment to Mexico as minister in 1825, for example, one friend instructed him not only to, quote, "make a good commercial treaty for us, but to, quote, take care of the ladies." So the mother of Poinsett's child has remained unknown, and the existence of his son only appears in 3 letters to, again, Isaac Johnson. And unfortunately, Poinsett never mentioned her name in writing. He said slightly more about his son, with whom he spent some time in the summer of 1824, writing that, quote, "the little fellow has become very dear to me," end quote. But although we know he instructed Johnson to christen the child with the name James Byrne, and this was the name, James Byrne is a common name, but it was the name of a South Carolina naval officer who had electioneered for Poinsett. So perhaps it was done as some sort, I'm not really sure why, but it's difficult to pick Poinsett's son out of all the James Byrneses listed in the census over the course of the 19th century. So I've not been able to track him down specifically. Had the boy's mother lived, she would have been responsible for raising him, but Poinsett clearly felt obligated enough not to completely abandon his son. And so he relied on his kind of fraternal connections to absolve himself of the responsibility of identifying as James's father, other than providing occasional sums of money for this precious charge. So he cared enough to make sure that the child would be taken after, but after that, he kind of removed himself, and he didn't want anybody to know about this. So while Poinsett was serving in Congress, so kind of while this is happening, while his son is born and he's figuring out what will happen with him, he's serving in Congress. And President James Monroe requested that he go on another sort of fact-finding mission, because following a decade of independence, let me go back. So he's serving in Congress, and during this time, in 1822-23, James Monroe requested he go on another kind of fact-finding mission, because the new Mexican Congress had created a constitutional monarchy. And this was a bit confusing for U.S. leaders. They weren't sure how to deal with this nation that had declared independence from Spain, but now is calling itself a constitutional monarchy, which kind of goes against the United States ethos. So U.S. leaders who were already conflicted about the status of Spanish American independence, again, didn't quite know how to react. So Poinsett travels around Mexico, meets with officials, and then submits his notes to the president, conveying the mission the message that the Mexican administration was unstable and that the U.S. should wait to recognize independence. However, it was too late. Monroe had, while Poinsett was in Mexico, had already received Jose Manuel de Zoya as Mexican minister to the United States. So over the next 2 years, Poinsett's notes were published nationally as well as in Britain, and his writings provided readers in the United States the most complete collection of information on Mexico they had yet received. So Poinsett, he goes again as this kind of secret agent, and his notes are published in 1823, and then he returns to Congress for a little bit, and then soon after he resigns to serve as the United States' first official diplomat to Mexico. So he had gone as, like, again, a kind of a secret agent. And then because Monroe had already opened diplomatic channels with Mexico by receiving their minister plenipotentiary, he appoints Poinsett as the United States' minister plenipotentiary to Mexico. So Poinsett arrives in Mexico in the spring of 1825 and almost immediately instigated a general distrust of American interference. So unfortunately, although Poinsett again kind of is the beginning of official relationships between U.S. and Mexico, he doesn't really get the United States off to a good start, and he basically breeds a general distrust of U.S. involvement in Mexico. And to this day, I would say Poinsett's name is more common or well known in Mexico than it is in the United States, not because of the poinsettia, but because he's not generally liked there. So Poinsett's first stop upon arriving in Mexico was the Spanish fortress in Veracruz, which was the last site of Spanish military occupation in Mexico. So he meddles in the negotiations between a Mexican and Spanish commander, but does nothing to improve the outcome. He basically just sets the tone as an American who thinks they know what is best for the Mexican people. Next, he visited the estate of a wealthy Philadelphia merchant to discuss Americans' financial claims on the Mexican government, as well as to discuss opportunities for investing in mining ventures. He also helped establish a Masonic lodge specifically to organize opposition to the ruling Centralista Party. So I mentioned Poinsett's a Freemason. He becomes a Freemason in the late 18 teens. He starts out in a chapter in South Carolina, and the Masons had, an international fraternal organization, and Poinsett helps establish a lodge in Mexico that he will basically use to try to influence politics. So he organizes this Masonic lodge specifically to oppose the ruling party in Mexico, which he saw as antithetical to U.S. interests because of its close ties to British business. And when this rising opposition had some political success, Poinsett used his Masonic connections to secure favorable plots of land for himself and his friends and to establish a U.S.-based mining company. So as soon as Poinsett gets a few Mexican or kind of Mexican connections and starts to establish himself politically with the opposition party, and they have some success, he's able to use that to kind of get favors for himself and some friends. And it was on a mining trip, as I mentioned at the beginning, in which Poinsett admired the flower that becomes a poinsettia and sent it back to the United States. So in 1828, so partway through his tenure, Poinsett supported and possibly abetted what was essentially a coup in Mexico City. He and his political allies contested the election of a president whom they saw as less amenable to their own financial interests over, and so they supported this opponent, Vicente Guerrero. So what became known as the Acordada Revolt, some of Guerrero's supporters occupied an arsenal and ransacked markets. And after several days of fighting between the rebels and government forces, Pedraza fled, and Congress declared Guerrero Poinsett's chosen president. So Guerrero's presidency meant that Poinsett's closest friend in Mexico, a statesman named Lorenzo Zavala, gained more economic and political influence. Once Guerrero took office, Zavala became Minister of Treasury and received a large land grant in Texas, which he and Poinsett used to form a real estate promotion firm called the Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company. Newspapers in Mexico began reporting about Poinsett's malicious interference. And in a document titled La Conducta de Mr. P, the Mexican legation, so I saw this when I was doing research in Mexico City. So in a document titled La Conducta de Mr. P, the Mexican legation in Washington requested Poinsett's removal from his post. And President Guerrero, despite the fact that Poinsett had endorsed him, did not want to face political blowback from his constituents. So he asked President Andrew Jackson to recall him. And as happens often in politics, rather than recall him, Jackson simply asked Poinsett to resign. And this did nothing to interfere with his career advancement. So Poinsett indeed resigned and returned to the United States in 1830. And as I said, this did nothing to interfere with career advancement. So 7 years later, Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, appointed Poinsett as Secretary of War. Now, this is partly a reward for Poinsett's loyalty to Jackson's administration during what is known as nullification crisis. In the early 1830s, this is a confrontation between the U.S. federal government and South Carolina over the state's attempt to nullify federal tariffs, which nullifiers in South Carolina viewed as unconstitutional and harmful to its economy. This crisis escalated tensions between states' rights and federal authority. So what is notable is that Poinsett, during this crisis that is seen as kind of a precursor to the Civil War, it's this flare-up of states' rights rhetoric and talks about secession and nullification. But during this crisis, Poinsett, who at this point is kind of just back at home, he's involved politically, but he doesn't have any major posts. During this crisis, he serves as President Jackson's kind of secret correspondent on the ground, and they're sending all these letters back and forth, and Poinsett's telling him about nullifier activities in Charleston. Poinsett gave a speech against nullification, arguing that, quote, to be respected abroad, we must maintain our place in the Union, end quote. And interestingly, Jackson, who officially received congressional approval to use military force against South Carolina officials if they continued to violate the law, before he received this congressional approval, he and Poinsett actually sent secret correspondence back and forth outside of the regular post. And Jackson sent 5,000 muskets and other military equipment to Charleston Harbor, concealed in camouflage boxes. He then instructed military officials to refer privately to Poinsett for access to these weapons. So Jackson was orchestrating basically federal force against the nullifiers before he was authorized by Congress to do so. And he's prepping for that through Poinsett. So these letters, the secret correspondence between Jackson and Poinsett was just fascinating. And ultimately, this crisis is resolved. There's a compromise tariff in 1832, and this whole thing settled down, 32-33. But because of his loyalty, Poinsett is partly because of this. Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, rewards him with this post of Secretary of War. I should also say, just quickly, I mentioned that Poinsett finally got married at age 54. Before he becomes Secretary of War, and kind of in that in-between period between Mexico and then Secretary of War, when he's back in South Carolina, he got married at age 54. And in this marriage, he gained a large rice plantation and about 100 enslaved individuals. And so Poinsett was somebody who had owned several slaves early in life, whom he inherited from his father, but they lived in the city and didn't have a big plantation. So he was not a large-scale slave owner early in life, but once he gets married, he becomes essentially a plantation owner and an enslaver, and he'll spend his retirement on that plantation, and again, suddenly having this status as an enslaver. So again, so he gets married after the nullification crisis, and then Van Buren becomes president, appoints him as Secretary of War in 1837. And a major thing that Poinsett was tasked with was overseeing Indian removal, which Jackson had signed into law in 1830. And although the forced removal of approximately 50,000 individuals is usually associated with Jackson, okay, so he signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830 into law, and he was a notorious Indian killer, as they said. The majority of this Indian removal, specifically the infamous Trail of Tears, which was the forced and deadly displacement of Cherokee people, this happened under Poinsett's watch. He would actually oversee the removal of 4/5 of Native peoples beyond the Mississippi. Now, one particularly difficult region for removal that the United States did not have the same kind of control over as they did with the Trail of Tears situation. This difficult region was Florida, where this long and expensive war was carried out against the Seminoles. By December 1838, Florida was effectively a military occupation zone, but even with increased personnel, the U.S. military still could not defeat the Seminoles. It's like maddening to the War Department. Now, Congress actually wanted a peaceful termination of the war, and so did even some of the military officers. Poinsett, however, believed that peace was pointless. He first advocated occupation by armed settlers, but became increasingly convinced of the benefits of bloodhounds as an efficient way to locate Seminoles for execution and to thus more effectively end the war. So Poinsett authorized the purchase of bloodhounds, and there's a letter showing the costs there from the Library of Congress. So he authorized the purchase and then later claimed that the department knew little about bloodhound purchases in Florida. Once this becomes known, there's a lot of negative pushback because Indian removal is controversial to begin with, especially among people in the North. And so there's all these negative cartoons about Poinsett. This cartoon pictured there, it's a harsh criticism of the Van Buren's administration's use of bloodhounds, and this is because of Poinsett's authorization of this. And in the cartoon, Poinsett presents a flag that bears the image of an Indian's head carried by a dog. The guy on his knees is Preston Blair. He shows the troop of hounds a map of Florida and says, quote, "I take pleasure in pointing out to you, my brethren in arms, the seat of war, the honor of terminating which our master has put in the hands of our race. I have no doubt you will all prove, like myself, good color men in his cause," blah, blah, blah. But basically this this type of opposition and these negative cartoons are kind of common during Poinsett's tenure as a Secretary of War. And so then, and sorry, I'll be wrapping up shortly. So for a variety of reasons, including financial downturn, the election of 1840 was a referendum on the whole administration, and the results were resounding. The opponent, William Henry Harrison, won 234 of the electoral votes, and Van Buren's whole administration was out. And so Poinsett did very little to kind of contribute to Van Buren's popularity. Poinsett officially retired from public life when Van Buren is voted out of office. But he was not done trying to influence national development. And this is kind of where he, I think, maybe redeems himself from some of the things that had been unpopular earlier. So he officially retired from public life, but he does a bunch to influence what becomes the Smithsonian. So right before Poinsett became Secretary of War, actually, Congress had received a $500,000 gift from British scientist James Smithson. And Smithson's will stipulated that if his nephew died without heirs, his wealth should go to the United States to establish an institution, quote, for increase and diffusion of knowledge. And this is what would become the Smithsonian. But this only happened because of the vision of Poinsett and several others. So Congressman had to decide exactly how to spend that bequest. And as you can imagine, nothing happened for a while. And debates lasted a decade, which absolutely infuriated Poinsett. So the project of establishing a national museum and research institute and using science for economic advancement, this would occupy much of Poinsett's retirement. He was co-founder of the National Institution for the Promotion of Science, and at the one-year anniversary in 1841, he gave a speech entitled Discourse on the Objects and Importance of the National Institution for the Promotion of Science, established at Washington. And the purpose of this speech was to encourage federal use of an Englishman's bequest to create a national government-operated scientific establishment that would include an observatory and a national museum to house collections and botanic and zoological gardens would be constructed, along with laboratory facilities to study every branch of physical science. He said that individuals had already given collections to the National Institute that he had helped found, and this could form the foundation of a national museum if the U.S. government were to endow the institution with Smithson's bequest. And then he said if they did so, donations would also increase and more people would want to give to this national museum. Finally, Congress passed an act to establish the Smithsonian Institution for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men in August of 1846. Now, although this Smithsonian was entirely independent of the National Institute, the Smithsonian that ultimately opened in 1855 after Poinsett's death reflected his vision of an exhibition of all the specimens the various exploring expeditions had collected. So Poinsett oversaw the famous exploring expedition from 1830, around 1838 of the Pacific during his time as Secretary of War. And so this would be an exhibition that hosts specimens from that as well as from various other exploring expeditions. And in this respect, his plan, Poinsett's plan, beat out all the others, including that of the Institute's first president, who actually wanted the Smithsonian to serve only as a research institution and not as a national museum. And then in 1858, again, after Poinsett died, the Smithsonian acquired the objects of the National Institute, whose collection Poinsett had helped create. So they ultimately got the stuff that Poinsett had overseen. And so that was kind of one major thing that occupies much of Poinsett's final decade. In addition, as I said, he had gotten married in the 1830s, in his 50s, and he kind of retreated to that private life. He spent time on his plantation with his wife. They had, she had a son. They had step-grandchildren, or he had step-grandchildren. And they traveled some. They'd go up north. They would go to their summer home in Greenville, South Carolina. And then in the last year of his life, Poinsett gave 2 final addresses on the importance of union, as South Carolinians once again debated the possibility of disunion in response to, of course, national checks on the expansion of slavery. And while on vacation in New York during the last summer of his life in 1851, he sent a letter to a July 4th celebration in Greenville, writing that the United States was, quote, a great and prosperous nation, and that South Carolina would stand alone, quote, as an insignificant state, unable to support or defend itself were it to secede. And unfortunately for him, of course, the United States went to war, despite his calls for union over states' rights talks. And he died on December 12, 1851, of a lung infection en route between his city home in Charleston and his mountain home in Greenville. He was buried several days later in the Church of the Holy Cross Cemetery in Statesburg, South Carolina. And after his death, he was lauded by some. For just one example, the Charleston Courier announced with deep and sincere regret the death of this eminent citizen and retired statesman, and praised the unabated vigor of his intellect and his patriotic interest in the welfare of his country, end quote. In Mexico, however, he was remembered as a man of loathsome memory, whose political meddling and Machiavellian management of diplomacy were responsible for, quote, the misery of Mexico. And so he has a complicated legacy, but I believe that, yes, we cannot fully understand early national United States without the story of Poinsett and his influence. So I'll stop there. Thank you for bearing with me, and I am happy to take questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Very interesting. Reminder to the live audience, we would love to have your questions, and you can pop them in right below your video there. And I have one to get us kick-started from Michael, class of 77. And he says, why didn't Poinsett grant Wilkes a higher rank when he put him in charge of the XX?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So I'm glad you brought this up. I mentioned this exploring expedition just only briefly. And this was an expedition. So Poinsett ended up overseeing this exploring expedition that took off in 1838 of the Pacific with Charles Wilkes as commander. This is an expedition that actually had been authorized earlier, but then a whole bunch of things interfered, including congressional delay. And this expedition was really something that should have fallen under the purview of the Secretary of Navy, but because Van Buren thought that Poinsett would actually be better suited, he ends up kind of overseeing the beginning of this. But Wilkes is granted his position, I think, by the Secretary of Navy. And he and Poinsett don't actually have a very great relationship. Wilkes is also court-martialed during this expedition. So I think it can mostly be attributed, the appointment, to the Secretary of Navy rather than Poinsett.
Okay, good. Yeah, please go ahead and type in questions if you have them for Lindsay. We'll see if anything else comes in as we wait here. All right. All right. This question is from Susan. Besides the child that Poinsett had, was there anything completely surprising that you discovered while researching?
Yeah, so I had seen his name in different things. So I was mostly surprised at how many things he was involved in. The fact that as a young man, he's a secret agent in South America, and then he's Secretary of War. And I think what most surprised me actually was I didn't realize what a big role he had in what we call the Trail of Tears. And in some ways, we could blame much of the kind of misery and death that resulted on Poinsett, unfortunately. And so that was surprising to me because the story that I had mostly heard was like Indian removal equals Andrew Jackson. The other thing that was surprising was actually how close Jackson and Poinsett were. And Poinsett was always writing to him for advice. And so in Poinsett's papers, there's these great letters from Jackson, who's writing from the Hermitage in his retirement in kind of shaky old man handwriting. But he advises Poinsett throughout. So that was surprising to me.
So it sounds like Poinsett was, in agreement and pushing the plan forward, not just following orders from Jackson. Is that?
Yeah, definitely. Because there's even examples of him kind of like interfering with things that could have led to more peaceful outcomes. And even the fact that with like the Seminole War, there are plenty of people, including military officers, who just want the war to end and kind of want peaceful termination. And he's really determined to see out removal in its kind of fullest extent.
All right. This question's kind of related from Marianne, class of 73. To what extent was Poinsett a typical 19th century white man? It seems his attitudes would have served him well in the USA at that time.
Yeah, so he's typical in a lot of ways, but he's also, he's exceptional in his kind of breeding and social class and his cosmopolitan nature. And Poinsett is kind of a walking, almost not a contradiction, but he does a lot of things that are surprising for somebody. Like he's a South Carolinian who favors national strength over states' rights. He's an enslaver who actually talks often about trying to end the institution, and he wants the U.S. to move this, especially the South, to move away from economic dependence on cotton and rice and other kind of slave-grown commodities. So he's constantly trying to find kind of other economic opportunities and other crops or other things that the South could do so that it's not so reliant on slavery. And there's plenty of women that he respects a lot, and there are others who he writes in typical ways about. So I think what's so interesting about him is he defies easy categorization. And so, yes, in many ways, he has much of the kind of racist, classist, misogynistic language that was common among white men at the time. And also, he was perfectly capable of thinking beyond that.
All right. From Kelly, I was really impressed by the breadth of your research. How long did it take for you to do this archival research, and what were some of the challenges you faced in doing so?
Oh, great question. Thanks. So this project, I guess, really began in 2016. I had a research fellowship at the library company in Philadelphia to finish my first book, the one that I mentioned that got me kind of into Poinsett. And somebody had said, oh, hey, there's some War Department guys that have papers actually next door at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. You should check them out. And one of them was Joel Roberts Poinsett. And I was like, oh, yeah, he was Secretary of War. So I was looking at his stuff, his papers, to find kind of anything on like war material, weapon procural, etc. And then I was like, his papers are fascinating. And I realized that they had like the full span of his life. And I became obsessed. I like photographed everything, transcribed, and then after I left Philadelphia, I was like, you know what? I think he needs a book. And I realized that most biographies of him had been, were super, super old and outdated. And I wanted to use his life to understand this period in kind of fresh ways. So the book, I guess it began really in like 2016, and then the book was published in the end of 2000. See, I live in the 1800s, 2023. So, a good 7 years or so. And then I went, other places. There's some papers of him in South Carolina. I was in DC for a while. I went down to Mexico.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Kelly also just asked, was it common for men to get married so late in life?
No, most would have been. So Poinsett was like a bachelor. I mean, we have some notable bachelors, some of whom were, president, and that's always remarked on. And Poinsett, I think, just because he was always traveling, I'm not really sure why it was so late. And again, I'm sure he had plenty of relations with people earlier on. But yeah, he found domestic, bliss, he says, late in life. But that was not common. Most of his colleagues were married much earlier.
Makes sense. Okay, good. Well, I think we covered the questions. Lindsay, thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Congratulations on the books. And
thank you.
Yeah, if you haven't checked out the book yet, hopefully this was a good intro, and you can grab that. We have a link in the listing. And yeah, we really appreciate your time, especially during this January J term. For those of you watching, and we, by the way, had alumni from the classes of 1965 all the way to 2014 on this presentation. So
wow, thank you.
We appreciate you watching and hope that you will check out our other webinars on our webinar site there. And I guess with that, we'll sign off. Love and honor. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you so much. Love and honor. Bye.
Yeah.